Okay. So there's two other spinal reflexes that we're going to talk about, and they actually kind of correspond to one another. All right, the first one's called the withdrawal reflex, and the other one is the crossed extensor reflex. This is going to be in one of those situations here in which pain is involved. So the withdrawal reflex can involve you reaching for a hot pan, and you touch the like a flame or something, and you pull back. We're going to use the lower extremity for an example because it explains the cross extensor reflex a little bit easier. So keep in mind here, all right, our stimulus is going to be a painful stimulus here. So that's going to stimulate our pain receptors, and those are called nociceptors. Again, we'll learn about these receptors in more detail in chapter 16. Okay, but the nociceptor, all right, picks up the pain stimulus, transmits that pain information along the sensory neuron into the spinal cord, and then we're going to excite some interneurons. Those interneurons will then excite our motor neurons to the flexor muscles. So since we're talking about flexor muscles in our lower extremity, if it was our upper extremity, the flexor muscles would be the biceps brachii, that would bend the elbow, okay? In the lower extremities, our flexor muscles are going to be the hamstring muscles. They're going to bend the knee. So that will cause the limb to contract, all right, the muscles to contract, and the limb will withdraw from the painful stimulus. So we'll see too, at the same time, some reciprocal inhibition occurring, because again, we don't want to interfere with our flexor muscles. So what we need to do is we need to shut off our antagonistic muscle group, take them offline, so our flexor muscles can operate not uninhibited, okay? So what we'll do is we will inhibit the extensor muscle group, that would be the quadriceps, so our withdrawal reflex can occur without any issue. So let's show you, I'm going to show you just the withdrawal reflex first. Okay, so here you are, you're walking along, and for any of you that have ever stepped on a Lego in the middle of the night, you know what I'm talking about here. All right, in this scenario, we have a sharp rock, so you're out walking around barefoot. Okay, you step on that sharp rock. All right, the nociceptors are activated and they send that painful stimuli along the sensory neuron all the way up into the spinal cord. But what we'll see is then the sensory nerve will stimulate, all right, the interneuron. That interneuron will then activate the motor neurons to the flexor group. That will be the hamstring group here. Now, it's not on this picture, right? But also at the same time, the interneurons will inhibit the alpha motor neurons that are going to go to the extensor group. That would be the quadriceps femoris group here, and it would inhibit and shut these muscles off. So the hamstring muscles, our flexors, can work and not be impeded by anything. So we can pull away from that painful stimulus as quickly as possible. All right, I know it's not here on the diagram, but keep in mind there is an alpha motor neuron that would be going to our quadriceps muscle group, and that muscle group would be inhibited. Okay, that brings us to our crossed extensor reflex. So if you notice in our picture here, right, when this occurs, you're lifting your one limb. In this case, it's the right leg. You're bending the knee there and lifting that right leg away from the painful stimulus. So what happens to the left limb? What goes on there? Let's find out. That's where the crossed extensor reflex becomes involved. So as the withdrawal reflex is occurring, all right, at the same time, some interneurons are going to decussate and cross over the midline, and they're going to stimulate the extensor muscle group, all right, on the other side of the body. And it will make sure that your leg stays straight, so your knee does not bend. Because we need to support your body weight as you're withdrawing your right limb, your left leg is going to bear the weight of your body. And so we want to make sure that we're stimulating, right, the extensor muscle group to keep the knee straight. So let me show you. All right. So while the withdrawal reflex is occurring, that same sensory neuron is going to stimulate an inner neuron, and that inner neuron is going to go and decussate and cross over, and it's going to activate a motor neuron on the other side of the body. And in this case, it's going to stimulate the extensor muscle group to the opposite lower extremity. So it sends that information down, and that will stimulate the quadriceps femoris muscle group here in our left leg, keeping the knee straight so you can support your body weight as you pull, all right, your other limb, your right leg, away from the painful stimulus. That's the crossed extensor reflex. Both of these reflexes are polysynaptic, right? And our crossed extensor reflex, that reflex is a contralateral reflex. The stimulus and the effector are on opposite sides of the body, whereas with the withdrawal reflex, that's all ipsilateral. All that occurs on the same side. Okay, last part is, why do we test reflexes? Okay, well, just like with a lot of tests that you do in medicine, or pretty much you're going to want to test out your differential diagnosis. We're trying to figure out our diagnosis. So reflexes are going to be helpful in trying to tell us what's wrong. So if I'm doing, like, this is when you go in and you sit down on the examination table and the doctor's coming in there and they're tapping you with this reflex hammer, or scraping something across the bottom of your foot, they're trying to initiate some sort of reflex. And as you know, reflexes, we all know the reflex arc now. What does it involve? Okay, it involves a stimulus, but it involves receptors, it involves sensory neurons, it involves motor neurons, and it involves effectors. So we need to then now figure out, if you have an abnormal reflex, what the cause is. So when we're looking at our reflexes, you can have a hypoactive reflex or a hyperactive reflex. If it's hypoactive, all right, we might see no reflex whatsoever or a diminished response. This will tell us normally that there's some sort of damage to the spinal cord, or you can have some sort of muscular disease going on, something that may have caused muscles to degenerate. Because if the muscle is our effector organ and it's degenerated, most likely it's going to display no result at all, or diminished reflex. Or we can see something going on at the neuromuscular junction, because we now know everything that's involved in a reflex. Now, if you have a hyperactive reflex, I go to tap your knee with the hammer and your leg shoots straight out in front, and it stays there for a few moments and then it relaxes. That's a hyperactive reflex. And when we see that muscle or that limb, like your leg, when it shoots out straight and it'll start to shake a little bit, we call that clonus. All right. This tells us now we're going to be dealing with something in the central nervous system, and that includes the brain and or the spinal cord. If clonus is involved, all right, hyperactive reflexes are indicative of what we would call an upper motor neuron lesion. And you remember where the upper motor neurons are located. They start off, right, they originate in the primary motor cortex, and they descend all the way down through the brain and the spinal and the brainstem down into the spinal cord. So you can have an issue anywhere along that whole path of the upper motor neuron. Usually, if you're dealing with a hypoactive reflex, all right, we're thinking lower motor neuron. So usually, again, that's where we start to think spinal cord. All right, brain, we don't really think about that too much. Okay, for a hypoactive reflex, we're thinking, all right, the lower motor neuron. Wow, try to get that out. All right, the lower motor neuron now is damaged, And so where is that located? In the anterior horn of the spinal cord and exits out through the spinal nerve. So that's why we start to think the spinal cord or some sort of muscular disease, or, right, an issue between where the nerve is innervating the actual effector tissue, the muscle, the neuromuscular junction. So that's why it's important that we test reflexes. Okay, awesome. I just wanted to go through that and wrap that up there real fast.